in music history in general, we do see a progression of simple to complex and then going back to simple again. There's sort of this roller coaster. And I think Baroque really got to extremely complex music.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.
Hi, and welcome to And If Love Remains. I am your host, Mike Lovett, with my co-host, Elias Axel Pedersen. Welcome to the show, Elias. Glad I can have you again, and we're going to talk some Baroque.
I'm excited. It's one of the titles for some book or some meme a long time ago, Going Baroque.
Right.
I think that's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's for sure. And you can't forget. I think it's in the movie. What the heck? What was it? The Beauty and the Beast, which says, "If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it." Something like that.
Oh yeah,
anyway.
If it ain't Baroque, that's right. Good music, a long time period to talk about too.
It is. By the way, and that was one of the things that's fascinating to me is how long of a period it is, and mm-hmm. of course, like. Even today, I don't know how you classify, like we say it's modern music, but what is that? Mm-hmm. What will people 100 years from now classify today's music as? I'm not sure. Going into what Baroque music is, like when we say Baroque music, what are we talking about? We're talking about a time period after the Renaissance, but like, how does that kind of fit in? And just a quick overview, when people talk about Baroque music, what are they talking about, Elias?
Yeah, well, so at least in Western European classical music, we're trying to sectionalize things so we can analyze them and talk about the change in styles. And just like with any genre or any field, you can't really put a year on something, like something started here and ended here. But typically we're talking about the early 1600s, around 1600 to about 1750. And that 1750 year is important because it's the death of J.S. Bach, who was one of the greatest composers of that era. And so we just kind of say the end of his life was the end of an era. Of course, that doesn't mean that he wasn't already pushing the boundaries. And at the end of his life, he was also pushing compositional techniques, and he was seeing some of the new instruments we're going to be talking about. So everything sort of overlapped. I like what you mentioned about contemporary music or modern music. We always teach that in our music history books as starting at 1900 till the present, but we're already in 2022. That's a long time, and there have been many musical movements that have sprung up in the 20th century. It's extremely diverse, and things are moving very fast. So,
and everything works with, like, for example, Rachmaninoff. You can make a very good, strong case for being, the last romantic composer. I mean, he was, his stylings and stuff, while mm-hmm. Fed on modern ideas, like the way his chord structures are, and his big kind of flamboyant pieces are mm-hmm. do reckon back to 50, 100 years earlier than when he lived.
Yeah, he was actually panned for that a lot. He was seen as this secondary or second-rate composer and pastiche composer, hearkening to the good old days that were supposed to be already dead. I mean, when he was performing and writing his second, third, fourth piano concerti, Schoenberg was already in the picture. Berg, the Second Viennese School. So he died in 1945 in Hollywood, and so by then we'd already gotten the Second Viennese School in 12-tone serialism, and almost getting into minimalism. So he was looked upon as second-rate, but actually he drew on so many great compositional techniques. He went as far as Bach in a lot of his pieces, a lot of counterpoint and beautiful soaring melodies, and he really was a first-rate composer. And now we realize that, I think, and I hope, even though he, during his lifetime, he wasn't maybe as well known or as successful as a composer, mostly as a pianist.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you bring up a point I think it's important to touch on, and I don't know the total history of it, but I don't think you can really talk about Baroque music without talking about counterpoint, because that, if I recall right, that was the primary means of people understanding or composers understanding how to write music, and this idea of counterpoint. Can you, how do you feel about talk a little bit about the role of counterpoint in Baroque music?
So I think the idea of counterpoint and having multiple voices working alongside or against each other really goes farther back. You mentioned, Renaissance music flowing into the Baroque. And when I think of Renaissance music, it's, Palestrina, Monteverdi, even before that. And for the keyboard, you get the earlier masters like Merullo, Froberger, which we'll touch upon. But there were a lot of singing parts, motets, things like that were written by the likes of Palestrina. And that would have come from probably the church tradition, as early as the 11th and 12th centuries, Perotin and those types. But you had many different voices, and they were just adding and compounding upon that. This was before even notation was really standardized. Way 1,000 years ago, notation wasn't, and even 500 or 600 years ago, it really wasn't standardized yet. So they were getting church singers, mostly male, of course, singing different parts in harmony, what we would call now harmony or polyphony, and how those parts interacted. You could get extremely dense, thick, intricate pieces written. I think there's a motet by, gosh, now I can't remember the name. I should look this up, but it's maybe 10 voices or something like that, something crazy.
Right.
So when we think of a Bach fugue, in 3 or 4 or even 5 voices, he has a couple 5-voice fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier, and in Art of Fugue, I think he has some 6-voice fugues, but that pales in comparison to a 10 or 12 part motet. And so you get all this. That was such the convention is singing. There were certainly string instruments that were accompanying. Though not so much in the church, more in the royal circles.
Right.
And you had the traveling troubadours with their guitars and their lutes and things like that. But keyboard, we're going to get into that. And the polyphony on the keyboard and counterpoint on the keyboard wasn't really at the fore yet.
Right.
It would come. It would develop later.
Yeah, and that comes really from the organ tradition and the what became the harpsichord. I guess there were probably earlier versions. I'm not sure what they'd be called, but these keyboard instruments that really changed the face of how we even hear music, and it made it a lot easier for a church to have, instead of having 4 or 5 or 10 voices, you could do the same thing on one organ.
Yeah, cuts the job force down. But
it sure does. Yeah, I'm sure the unions were not pleased. The guilds were not pleased with that.
Right.
Singers guilds.
Yeah.
How would you? So, like, if we were to put a definition or an oral representation of Baroque, the Baroque sound. How would you classify it? How would if somebody heard something that was Baroque, how would they know that?
Yeah, I remember studying again for music history, or even before that, little theory things in high school and middle school, and what were some of the characteristics of Baroque music, and one of them was terraced dynamics. We certainly talked about instrumentation, and the ensembles were smaller typically, so. There weren't big symphony orchestras at the time, and that was just a logistical matter. There were a lot of localized ensembles that would have been employed by kings or queens or dukes or duchesses or whatnot. But you didn't have the Chicago Symphony Orchestra or New York Philharmonic like we do today. So actually, a lot of people didn't hear those large instrumental groups. They were much smaller. There were not huge public halls yet. So all the sound, it would have been smaller. And we've talked about this with Mark Ainley and some others, how our ears and our perception and expectations have changed a lot with the music that we hear, and vice versa. They kind of help each other develop. And now I think a lot of people look at Baroque music and think it sounds boring. I think there's a lot of exciting things going on. In music history in general, we do see a progression of simple to complex, and then going back to simple again. There's sort of this roller coaster, and I think Baroque, maybe the medieval, like late medieval going into Baroque, really got to extremely complex music, and then the classical era was sort of a rebuke of that, or just um, it was a commentary and reaction to that. When you get early Haydn, Mozart, even CPE Bach, who was one of Bach's famous sons, the instrumentation and the texture is really pared down. It's really just one melodic line and a very simple accompaniment, almost harkening back to those troubadours, where they would be just playing on their lutes 400 or 500 years before. But when you get to the real thick of things in the Baroque era, even in the late, well, I guess early Baroque with Marullo and Froberger, if you look at some of their ornamentation and some of their writing for more organ and harpsichord, it's very dense and a lot of stuff going on, a lot of layers, a lot of textures, and those had to be differentiated somehow. And it would have been hard to listen to. I think it's still hard to listen to today. If I go to a full Bach recital, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy to listen to that. It's much easier, for instance, to listen to a Chopin or a Mozart or a Beethoven recital.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, when you have those, when you have those kind of soaring melodies that you can very distinctly hear and you can recognize and you can kind of follow. And you're right. I never thought of it that way, but that might be one of the reasons why some people think of Baroque music as boring, is because you do have to put your own energy into it. If you're listening to it, you have to like follow, where is this line going and how does it respond to another line, and especially if you're listening to a fugue or something, how do they work together? And if we're not accustomed to putting our own kind of energy into listening, it's just going to turn into kind of white noise at some point.
Yep, exactly. That's how you get overwhelmed, and that's often how it is.
Yeah.
But yeah.
One of the interesting, so one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on to talk about this is as a piano teacher myself, I'm kind of focusing on the Baroque period with my students. I'm having them each learn some Baroque music, and one of the reasons I think it is in a way kind of the grandfather of Western music. I know in my theory class, we would laugh and say, WWBD, what would Bach do? Would be the answer to many questions. But however, so I'm having my piano students learn this music at the same time, recognizing there was really no such thing as a piano at the time of these guys, and which creates some difficulty in deciding on making decisions on how pieces should be played, how they should be heard, and how we hear them today. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about that in context of the piano and keyboard, but the piano specifically, and how we deal with some of these I guess issues. They're just they're facts of what the music is versus what we what we're trying to do with it.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff to unpack, because when you're teaching, especially a younger student, you can't really get into all the details of how the piano developed and this or that. And it's doubtful that a child today would even have contact with an instrument like a harpsichord, maybe an organ. I mean, there are still organs in churches that are being actively played. There aren't so many church organists being employed anymore, but you can go to that and hear. But that's tough to think about.
In fact, another kind of instance that just happened to me recently, maybe a month ago, 2 months ago, a friend of mine in my church, actually, he owns a harpsichord. I didn't realize that. He owns a harpsichord, used to work on harpsichords. And so I was over at his house and I see this harpsichord and I was like, oh, I have never played an actual harpsichord.
It's different.
And so he had me play it, and it was such a different experience. The keys were so light and so small and so delicate. And the whole experience was such a different experience from trying to play a piano. And I thought, if this is what composers were writing for, they could not even conceive of a piano. It's both amazing that we can get the sounds we get out of a piano to sound, have this music sound good. And that's more of a, what great composers these guys were.
Yeah.
But
still sounds great on piano. Yeah.
It sounds great on piano. Yeah. Cause they're just, it's phenomenal pieces. I mean, it's just, they're works of art. But it was just an interesting experience for me to play that harpsichord and think about that in terms of what am I trying to do as a pianist? Am I trying to in some way replicate a harpsichord? Am I trying to enhance it? Like, what am I trying to do as if I'm playing a Bach prelude, for example?
Yeah, well, I think that's been, you're not the first to ask that question. And I think a lot of pianists, many famous ones who have specialized or devoted their lives just to playing Baroque music, and especially Bach, he seems to be the pinnacle. Although I would say that Handel, has some wonderful keyboard music, and Scarlotti too. Scarlotti wrote over 500 sonatas. They're not on the same scale of a Mozart or Beethoven sonata. They're shorter, usually binary or ternary forms, but wonderful pieces. And he wrote over 500 of them. And there are a lot of pianists that come on different sides of that equation or that argument, and quite vehemently. I mean, there is a famous back in the, I don't know what maybe the 50s or something. There was a famous harpsichordist, Vonda Londowska. She was a Polish harpsichordist, and she was part of the movement back then that chose to perform Bach, because keep in mind, a lot of these composers hadn't really been brought back or heard in public so much. There were revivalist movements of some of the old masters. And so she decided to really play Bach on harpsichord and on original instruments. And that was sort of the early instrument movement starting back then, before musicology and ethnomusicology was really an established field. And so she was playing Bach only on harpsichord and traveling with her instrument, whereas the likes of Rosalind Turek and many other, all other pianists at the time, all other keyboardists, because by then the piano had supplanted the harpsichord essentially. Actually, it had supplanted the forte piano, which had supplanted the harpsichord. But all the others were playing this music on piano, and there was a heated debate about what they should do. And Londowska told Turek, who was her junior at the time, you can play Bach the way you want to, meaning on the piano, and I'll play him his way. You can play Bach your way, I'll play him his way. He would have wanted it only on the harpsichord. And there's a good point to that. Bach never heard the modern piano. He never heard those huge sounds. There was no, this is before the Industrial Revolution, so he would never have heard a metal framed 9-foot concert grand in his life. He did hear at the end of his life some early models of forte pianos, which we'll get into. He died in 1750, and Bartolomeo Cristofori really invented, per se, the early modern piano, if you will, in around 1701, something like that. And he was really employed by the Medicis in Italy and had just a lot of support in creating these new instruments, keyboard instruments that could play loud and soft, or soft and loud. So the first names of those were pianofortes or forte pianos, as opposed to the harpsichords, which could only pluck the string at a certain velocity. And so you couldn't play the same note and get louder or softer on it. And I'm sure at your friend's house, you saw that it didn't matter how hard you played one note, it plucked the string at the same velocity. And so having something that would have a leather hammer at first, now felt, hit it at different velocities and have loud and soft was quite a change in sound.
Right. And that's probably, I don't know if this is the biggest thought process that you have to go through, but as a pianist, it's one of the biggest is, well, so does that mean, because obviously there aren't, I don't think in the original scores there aren't like real dynamics written in.
Right.
And so we have to kind of make up dynamics, and how do you do a true crescendo or diminuendo on something? Well, if you're trying to play it as a harpsichord, you really wouldn't. You'd either slow down or you'd have some other form of emphasis, but you wouldn't have the ability to have these kind of big, long, growing lines.
Yeah, right.
Or anything like that.
I think that's where the terrace dynamic come in. So most harpsichords, you had a couple keyboards, multiple levels of keyboard.
Terrace dynamics. Explain what that means.
Yeah, so that's basically where you have just levels of sound. You don't have these gradual crescendos or decrescendos where you're gradually getting louder and softer. You're just at a new level, louder or softer. And we have to also keep in mind that in Bach's day, though he might not have written dynamics for keyboard instruments, that could have been achieved on something like an organ or in an orchestra. So they did have dynamics, obviously, and they did indicate dynamics. But a lot of that was not indicated in the score because they just assumed everybody kind of knew what to play and how to do it. They all understood the context and just the practice of the time, the traditions. But there were also manuals written about how to do such and such, very intricate manuals, and we'll get into that. But the playing Bach, for instance, on a harpsichord or playing something by like Jean-Philippe Rameau, you might have two different keyboards, and one of the keyboards would have one plectrum, which would pluck the string, and one would have two plectrums, or it would pluck two strings instead of one string. So you could get something louder on the same note by just going to the other keyboard.
Oh, that's fantastic. That just reminds me so much of the piano, where on most of the strings, there's three strings that hit. But if you wanted to have a little softer, there's a pedal that would actually shift the hammers a little bit. So you only hit two. And,
yes. And that's supposed to only hit one, but because of the modern design, you can't quite get it over there. It would hit the next string. Yeah. It's called the una corda, but it really is the dua corda. In modern pianos,
right. And that's so that just harkens me back to that kind of concept that some of those old traditions still. You in preparation, you gave me a list of main composers for keyboard, the Baroque period, and you started with Claudio Merullo.
Yeah.
There we go. So why did you start with him?
Well, because actually, I only came into his music and Froberger because a friend of mine at a festival many years ago was playing some of their works on piano, and obviously there were slight transcriptions because they wouldn't have been written for piano. Merullo's way back in the 1500s and died in 1604, so he would have never even seen a forte piano, but he would have seen early harpsichords, early clavecin in French, and I just forgot the instrument you can play bebong on.
Is that the early version of like a clavichord?
Yeah, like clavichords, things. Yeah, like that. He would have seen those, and that's the one instrument you can do kind of vibrato on a string because the key actually hits. It's not a plectrum; it doesn't pluck the string. It actually has contact, and so if you vibrate the string, it actually vibrates the key. It vibrates the string, much like on a string instrument, like a violin or a cello.
Oh, so it's like what's that instrument called from France? I can't remember now. It's a handheld instrument. Oh,
it doesn't look like a viol. It looks like a violin.
It looks like a box, and you turn a handle, and I can't remember the name of it. It's got a funny
hurdy-gurdy?
name. Hurdy-gurdy.
Oh yeah, hurdy-gurdy. Yeah, those are awesome.
They are awesome. They're so great, and they play. So they have a you play a key, but it actually it's a string. It's a rotating wheel with a felt or something on it that goes up against a string, and so like a violin, it'll play. And then with the clavichords, you can't increase the sound once you've really played. You can't re-strike the string unless you let the key go. But when you're in contact with the string, if you wiggle your finger, vibrate your finger, it has a little, little that's
noise.
fabulous.
Like on an electric guitar when you have the what is that called?
The whammy bar.
The whammy bar, yeah. It's kind of like a whammy bar because it's pulling in the string, And so those are cool. So he would have encountered those. But in any case, I heard some of these transcriptions from harpsichord or organ even, to piano. And they were really cool, very ornate. And I printed some of those out, and I've always wanted to perform them. There have been romantic pianist composers. When I say that, the romantic era of pianism is different from the romantic era of music. I'm thinking of like 20th century Tausig and or 19th century pianists actually, and who else? Who's the guy that did Firebird? Agosti. Those types, or Bauer, Harold Bauer, that would have made transcriptions of some of these great works. Myra Hess, she's a wonderful British. She was a wonderful British pianist. She did a transcription, as you know, of the Jesu, Joy Man's Desiring by Bach for keyboard, and it's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
And it really extends what the original theme was. And so we've got some of these things handed down to us, so we can continue the tradition. But those two composers that I mentioned, Merullo and Froberger, wrote just beautiful, ornate pieces that actually might have just been transcriptions of their own, what am I trying to say? Extemporaneous playing, or they were just, sitting down at the organ and trying to improvise something, and that's what was written down. Similar to Bach's first prelude, we often think of that written out perfectly. It's probably just an improvisation on a nice chordal progression,
right?
And that's what we have passed down to us. And he created, the Bach, the well-tempered clavier, based starting with that one, but based on those kinds of efforts.
We need to get into that at some point. But you mentioned a word a few times that I kind of want to delve into, and that's the word ornamentation. And because you see a lot of that in Baroque music, all over the place. There's a lot of these kind of ornaments, and when we talk about ornaments, what do we mean by an ornamentation or ornament?
Yeah, so it's an embellishment of a note or of a group of notes. You mentioned before that it would be very difficult to create, volume or difference in volume on a harpsichord. And some of the ways that harpsichordists use, or some of the tools they have to create those sound effects, are going to another keyboard, as I mentioned, but also they can adjust the timing, like you mentioned, or they can roll, like instead of playing a chord solidly, they can roll it, so it takes a little more time to get through all the notes. So your ear is kind of capturing more sound. It seems like there's more sound, even though there might not be. And another way would be to ornament something. So instead of playing a singular note, let's say it was a C, there might be a trill on that C, so you'd play DC, DC. And I can show you a few examples of those. Yeah. But there are many different kinds of ornaments for notes, and depending on the piece and depending on the composer and the sign that they would indicate, you would have to know how to play all those ornaments. And some composers wrote entire like catalogs of, okay, when I say this kind of symbol, when I write this symbol, it's this kind of ornament, and you do this with the note.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty cool.
And it is one of the cool aspects of it, because it is kind of a magician's trick that pianists and keyboardists can play, where we've talked many times about how when you hit a key on a piano, it's done, it's over with. You can't do anything about that. But you can trick the brain by playing it over and over and over again, and with another key. Now you have this trill, and now you can have the idea, or a tremolo. Now you have this idea of a growing one. It becomes one sound where it can grow or get softer, and it's a cool trick that we have in our toolbox.
Yeah, I think a lot of later, you get into classical and romantic and beyond that, you don't have a ton of different kinds of ornamentation. That they exist, but the trill is really used a lot, and maybe the turn. But I'll just read a couple of these, and maybe I can demonstrate a few at the piano.
Yeah,
so people can hear what they sound like. Yeah, so there's a trilo, there's a mordant or mordant, trilo und mordant. By the way, I'm getting all of this from CPE Bach. Wrote this ornament table. Basically, he wrote a treatise, if you will. How to, what is it called? Like how to, I think I wrote it down at some point here in my notes. Johann Joachim Quantz wrote something on playing the flute, where he talked about different kinds of methods and ornaments. And then CBE Bach wrote something called the Essay on the True Art of Playing Keyboard Instruments. And he was Bach's son. He was born in 1714, died in 1788. And so he came up with this list, this table of different ornaments. And so the Trilo, Mordaunt, Trilo und Mordaunt, the cadence, the doppelt cadence, and the idem, and then some others. So I'm going to just play the first 6 that I mentioned, and it's all based around the note C. So instead of C, you're going to hear these different versions of it. And I'm going to take my headphones off, so I hope I'll be able to still react for the next 30 seconds. But here we go. Okay.
All right. So as he's going there, and you're going to see some subtle differences and some not so subtle differences between each of these ornaments. But they were all important. So I think we're about ready to.
Okay. I think I'm ready. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So this would just be a note, just a C. There's a treble C. So that's what it would sound like. So if I played that on a harpsichord, of course, the sound would die away very quickly. So here's one way to embellish that: the trilo, which would be, just adding a few notes above. And here would be the mordant or mordaunt. So you're kind of dipping below. You're going C, B, C. And then here's a trilo und mordaunt would be above and then going below again, filling it out. And then there's the cadence or cadence, which would be just, right? And then there's a doppelt cadence, so it would be kind of coming from below and going above again. And then idem or idem, which would be, right? So those are just a few. There are maybe another dozen or so ways to ornament that singular C. And if you were playing a note, with the accompaniment in the left hand, let's say, you could get a lot of mileage out of that one note and really let it sustain for a lot longer, much like a violin would be able to do. But now you can do that on a keyboard. Yeah, that's wonderful. What and you're right. Like when we get into the later period, the classical period and such, you don't see as much. However, my understanding was that artists and performers would still utilize them quite a bit, but more as a improvisational tactic more than within the composition itself. Yeah, oh, for sure. But I can think of in Chopin, for instance, he does a trill a lot, and there's a discussion on certain pieces. Do you come from the note above or do you go from the note below? In Mozart, for example, which ones do you use? And it depends on the context, but they don't use all of these. And the most common ones are trill, and they often go on for a long time. So you might have one note. I'm thinking of like the Ravel Piano Concerto, the G major, the second movement. You've got a trill on it, I think E and F sharp for I don't know how many measures, maybe 20 measures or something. And it just goes on and on and on. And that's just your basic trill. So you don't have all these other setups and turns after and before and all that. Well, and if I remember right, I remember a discussion talking about, and I want to say, was it Mozart's the Turkish March? Oh, could be. Huh? Anyway, where da 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 da. I remember a discussion where they were saying the reason why he used an ornament there as opposed to just writing in those notes was so that people wouldn't ornament it. I so see, in other words, it was a way that he used to make sure that people were going to play that instead of something else, and then that, if that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I didn't know that. That makes sense that he would. It's very well laid out and calculated. Yeah. So. And he still has the other ornaments later. It's not the same thing, but like the dun 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 dun, dun he has those right. Especially in the left notes. Hand, the guitar parts, I call it. yeah. That's kind of emulating that Janissary music, the low drums and the percussion stuff, and strumming, a lot of strumming. So guitar and stuff. So, cool. So this I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about Scarlotti. Mhm.
You have two Scarlottis here. So
Yes.
is this father and son like the Bach clan?
This is slightly smaller than the Bach clan. Bach had 21 kids, and Alessandro Scarlatti had, I think, 2 kids, but I'm not quite sure. But he had one son that was a famous composer. I think Bach had 4 or 5 sons and one grandson that I've actually played a piece by W.F.E. Bach, which was a grandson who's famous.
Not P.D.Q. Bach?
Not PDQ. Those of you wondering who that is, you can take a look. It's a fictitious composer. But anyway, but Alessandro Scarlatti was quite well known already, and then his son maybe became even more famous, especially for keyboardists, because of all the sonatas he wrote. He just wrote so many sonatas for keyboard, and not for piano, but for keyboard. So it probably would have been harpsichord or an early forte piano. But they're amazing.
Well, and that kind of brings up another point about the Baroque period in general. It's also where we get kind of the standardized, for example, the standardized forms, the Sonata Allegro form, a lot of the dances that you even see into the 19th century.
Well, not I would say not Sonata Allegro form yet, just the precursor to that, but all the dance forms, because that was really... that kind of comes from almost a ternary that was expanded when you get early Haydn, late CPE Bach, early Haydn, early Mozart. Okay. Really classical, but all of that.
So help me out. Define for me the difference between Sonata and Sonata Allegro, because I always kind of saw those as similar.
I think they're similar. Usually a sonata form is a first movement of a sonata, and it's usually an Allegro, usually a faster form. So that terminology is sort of interchangeable. But when we think of the sonata or sonata allegro form having the 3 parts, the exposition, development, and recapitulation, that's almost not quite an ABA, but close. Mm-hmm. So it's an expanded ternary form, and the ternary form was really developed a lot more in the Baroque era. It's not that it hadn't existed. Binary had certainly existed, and all of Scarlatti's sonatas, well, I don't want to say all of them because I don't know all of them. But most of them that I know are binary forms. But a lot of people in that era wrote in ternary forms. If you think of Bach with all the dance suites that he wrote in the English suites, French suites, partitas, in the minuets, you usually have minuet 1, then minuet 2, then you go back to minuet 1. Right there, that's a ternary form. Or you have the minuet trio and then back, that's a ternary form. So if you expand upon those, I don't know if there's a direct correlation, but I'm sure that was one impetus for the classical period developing the sonata form.
And I think we also have to discuss a little bit like the, if you will, the economics of the Baroque period. And here's what I mean by that. You might wonder, why do you have these dances, or why do you, the styles of music that you have are really come from 2 places. You're either going to have them from the church or you're going to have them from the court. And so you have a bunch of liturgical music, and you have a bunch of court dances and minuets and such. And that's where a lot of these things come from.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no question. You already answered the question. Yeah, it is. Money was a big driver, as it is always. And when you look at the wealthy kings and queens and dukes and whatever, they were the ones that owned these small orchestras and hired the musicians. And a lot of the great musicians from that day are associated with a particular nobleman. The Medicis in Italy were very famous and supported the arts a lot. That's where you have Cristofori, who developed the first forte piano, and certainly that would have trickled down to the likes of the Scarlattis. Mm-hmm. And when you have in Germany a little bit later, I'm talking about the Esterházys with Haydn, supporting Haydn and all those orchestras. But all of these royals and noblemen, they wanted to dance and have entertainment, and what better way than to have minuets and gavottes and sarabands and airs and all the movements.
And if you could have a court composer write original music for your specific minuet, what a great thing for your party.
Yeah, what a way to show your wealth. I've got Handel in my employ, and he's writing all the royal fireworks, the water music for King. So That's very impressive.
So you have a name here, Jean-Philippe Rameau, which I assume is French.
Yes.
Talk about Jean-Philippe a little bit.
Well, so Rameau was a great composer, and I bring him up because the ornaments that are in his music are pretty phenomenal and very intricate. And I don't think a lot of keyboardists play his music. Mostly it's Bach, and then way second place is Scarlotti, and that's kind of about it. We don't touch many others. But in more recent years, there's one of my favorite pianists, Gregory Sokolov, who has been recording, for many years, but he has put out a few things with some works by Rameau from this whole collection of pièces pour clavecin, I think, or pièces de clavecin. And one of them, I actually put a link there, which we can put in the program notes. It's from a piece called Le Poule, which is the chicken. And it sounds like, a chicken just pecking and going bagok, all the time. And the link that I gave you was just from a YouTube link of the very highly ornamented section in that piece. Although if you want to listen to the whole piece, it's about 2.5 minutes long. But he wrote incredible ordres. They're like these orders of groups of works for clavecin or harpsichord. And you can go online now on YouTube. It's such a phenomenal resource, and watch harpsichordists play these pieces. But not a lot of pianists play them. They're extremely difficult to play. There's one piece that is, again, I think it's an encore from a Sokolov recital that made it to a DVD, and it's a Rameau, what is it called? Le Tic Toc Choc. And it's written I actually did this for my class piano courses at school. I played them the original harpsichord version, which is written for two keyboards, two different keyboards. And because a lot of the notes, it's an F major, and a lot of the notes overlap. So you're having double Fs played, double Cs played. And then I asked them, well, that was played on two keyboards. How would you play that on a modern instrument? And some of them said, well, you'd probably need two pianos or two pianists. And I said, well, how would one person play it? And, they said, well, maybe play it an octave up. And I said, well, that's kind of cheating. You can't do that. You have to play it in the same register. It won't sound the same, blah, blah, blah. And then we watched Sokolov do it, and the manner in which he makes that work is just phenomenal. The hands are superimposed almost. And it's just so much clarity and ornamentation. So because I think of his performances, those pieces have skyrocketed and almost gone viral, and people are playing that stuff now. So I'd highly recommend, listening.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi, but before that, I got to talk about this guy that I'm not as familiar with, Cristofori.
Yes.
So let's talk about him, and then I want to go back and talk about the big three.
Well, he's a quick one. It's just that he was really the pioneer on the logistical end of keyboard development. Really, he was employed by the Medicis, and he was a performer himself. He's not well known as a performer or a composer per se. I've never seen any works that he performed, but he was a technician and very skilled one at that, and created these early models of forte pianos, just trying with new mechanisms, because he saw that the harpsichords were plucking the strings, and he just thought, what can we do to increase the possibilities and give us dynamics? And he created these models. I think one of them is in the Smithsonian behind some glass. I think it still actually works, and maybe they trot it out once a year and play it. But it has leather covered hammers instead of the typical ones that are felt now in modern pianos, but leather covered hammers, and they hit the string and instead of plucking the string. So he really developed that, and I think he made some for royalty in Russia. I can't remember. I should have done a little more research, but I do know that his models were the same ones that Bach would have seen late in his life. And at first he didn't like the new instruments, and probably they just were such early replicas, and they just didn't play very well. The action probably wasn't very solid or sturdy. And then they developed a lot more, but he probably saw some early ones, didn't like them, and then later some better models, improved models, and he said, oh, these are actually good. So that's where he fits in.
That's wonderful, and you can see that development of the early pianoforte, take place. That's a great piece of history there.
Yeah, and if we were talking about later, like into the classical and early or romantic eras, piano building and makers that exploded, and you get people like Mozart and Beethoven. We've spoken about this even when we had Tom Posen on, that with Beethoven, the piano maker was pushing him and he was pushing the piano maker.
Right.
So the range would have been, 5.5 octaves or something in Mozart's day. But by the time Beethoven, by the time of his death, the keyboard range had already extended an octave or almost an octave and a half, because the capabilities were there, the strengthening materials were there. We weren't quite to huge cast iron frames yet, but the range was getting bigger, and Broadwood and Walter, these people were making bigger and larger instruments with more sound, and the halls were people were going to concerts. It wasn't only royalty in the courts. So you might hear him in a salon, or certainly by Chopin and Liszt and Schumann's day, you were going to salon concerts, and you could have metal framed instruments.
That's actually, and that's something that I haven't thought about too much. But the idea of any instrument, but the piano specifically, becoming kind of the instrument of the people when it is such a big, heavy, expensive instrument. But if you thought about, let me put it this way: back in the day, I imagine, I could imagine, say Mozart playing a pianoforte, playing in a concert. What would that look like? Well, it was probably much different than what we imagine somebody playing a piano at Carnegie Hall.
For sure. Yeah,
there were not that many people. It was not that, in other words, you could get away with a smaller, more delicate instrument. Of course. Than you could today, for sure.
Yeah. And when you do trot out some of those early, like a forte piano in a hall, it's tough. You can't do it in a huge hall sometimes, or even when you do play Mozart concerti with modern pianos, you often see orchestras pare down the orchestra, so they don't use the 100 people, on stage. They might pare it down to 50 people, and that's plenty, for just the balance. And there was something else I was thinking about as you brought that up. That he would have played for smaller audiences, and I can't think of it now, but it will.
Okay, I'm sure it'll come back. It's okay. I want to talk about Vivaldi. Vivaldi is a really important composer. We all know him by his the Four Seasons, of course. That's maybe outside of some of Bach's pieces and Messiah, maybe the most well-known Baroque piece of all time. It's his Four Seasons. Yeah. But talk about Vivaldi and he, while he wasn't a keyboard composer, what was his influence and what made him an important composer during that time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I've actually played violin, and I've performed a couple movements from the Four Seasons as a violin soloist, actually, when I was in high school. But the that's such an influential work. But he wrote so much music and all the concerti grossi of that time. A lot of composers.
That's kind of where I was going. Is that the idea of the concerti grossi was he was a big influence on that, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean he wrote so many of those, and he did write other concerti where you were highlighting the instrument. It was a little different from the Romantic era where you really had the big soloist, hard on the sleeve kind of thing. And with the Baroque groups, you often played with the 2D sections, which are when all the orchestra members play. So when you see somebody play, for example, Summer from the Four Seasons, they might play some of the parts that everybody plays, and some of their things that they play are exactly the same. So he developed those. He had a lot of flute concerti. Quantz also is another composer from that era that wrote a lot of flute concerti. So wind and string instruments were really at the fore. Oh yeah, I was thinking of another thing that I was going to bring up. The piano is now sort of, I guess you could say, the king of instruments. All composers. Well, I don't know how many contemporary now you can be a composer and just work on a laptop, and create sound effects, and you can be more of a DJ producer type composer. But when we're talking about Western classical music still up till the late 20th century, all the great ones, or most of them, were using piano as one of their primary sources, or going to the piano to hear how things laid out and sounded together, because you can. But obviously, piano wasn't always the king. I would say organ was the king of instruments for a long time, and that became just the place to hear everything at once. You could do so much on an organ if you went, and that was one of the main places people heard live music. Was you go to church and you hear either singing or organ.
And if you think about an organ, it really was. I think of it almost as an ancient synthesizer, because you could really sculpt the sound like no other instrument could. You could have multiple instruments. You could do all sorts of things that we think of, synth players doing today. You would be doing on an organ.
Yeah, and I have to say, I don't know if there's anything that quite matches the glory when you go to an incredibly large church with a great organist and you have 10,000 pipes. There's very little that can beat that experience.
No. And by the way, that's the other interesting thing about an organ is that, and we'll say at church, primarily you're going to find them in churches. Yeah. So the church where you have this organ is really, that is the instrument. The instrument is the church itself. It's not
built
just,
in,
yeah. And so, well, I don't even mean like,
well, the resonance too. Yeah. Right. You can't really separate them.
You can't separate the hall. You can't separate what you're hearing. Where a violin, you can take that anywhere. It's the organ that's an experience you have to have in that one place at that one time.
Yeah. Some organs have been designed, or almost like the church edifice itself has been designed around the instrument, it seems.
Yeah.
And that's true. And you don't get that, at least with the Western monotheistic, the main three, you don't get instrumentation. Like I'm from a Jewish tradition, and Orthodox Judaism, you can't play instruments on the Sabbath, and that's when you would go typically to synagogue, as everybody would go on the Sabbath, and it would always be vocal. It would always be a cappella. And so as I've grown up, I've played in a lot of series that are at churches, oftentimes with an organ there, and they have an additional piano. It's much harder to play at a synagogue or have a series at a synagogue, because the infrastructure just isn't there, and it's not in the tradition that's been built for 500-600 years. So,
right.
It's kind of interesting how that still affects us.
It is. So we got to talk about Handel. Handel is it's funny. I'll ask my students, who is the big rock star in the Baroque period, and I think a lot of kids, especially, would say Bach. And that's not true. He wasn't a nobody, but he's pretty close to a nobody. It was really Handel was the big rock star during that period of time. In fact, I think there's stories of Bach attempting to go see Handel and missing him. But Handel is just a remarkable composer, and I think an underappreciated composer personally, even with Messiah. His water music. But talk to us about his keyboard music.
So it's interesting. Out of those big three, and I've played some other Baroque composers as well, but I've actually not performed Handel. He's written some incredible suites, one or two which are very famous. The Harmonious Blacksmith. I probably played a movement of that when I was very young. I just don't remember. But like you said, Bach was well known, kind of in a local level. He was known as the great organist and as a wonderful performer, and people would come from all over to hear him perform. But maybe in Germany, maybe in Austria, Handel was known throughout Europe. He was living in England. He was famous there, being writing music for the kings and queens, and he was very well known on the mainland in Europe, in Germany, Austria,
and this is when England kind of ruled the world. It was a very English centric world at that point.
Yeah, he was George. He anglicized his name. We think of him as George, not Georg or something, which it probably would have been in German, and Frederick, not Friedrich. But he was famous, and certainly his water music is well known. His Messiah is extremely well known. Some of his suites are sort of well known for piano, but not played that often. He doesn't have quite as much the volume of repertoire for keyboard as he did as someone like Bach or even Scarlotti. And he wrote a lot for different whatever that he was being paid to write. He was always at the beck and call of money, and he was a very wealthy composer in his lifetime. And so he just wrote tons of music for royalty. But he's a great composer.
And he's interesting. As I listen to him, he seems to be, if there's a bridge between kind of the early classical period, I do think of it as Handel, just because he seems to incorporate, even in some of the piano music or keyboard music, that idea of having a solo voice on top with an accompaniment, more so than Bach or Vivaldi or some of these other guys.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can see what you mean. He lived a long time too.
He did.
Let's see, did he outlive all of them? Well, but not by much. So Scarlatti, Bach, and Handel were all born the same year, and I think Bach died first, 1750, then Scarlatti 57, and Handel 59. So yeah, he did outlive them, not by much, but
wow, 1685 was enough. A good year.
Yeah, it was. 3 big names were born then.
So, okay, so Bach, we have to finish on Bach because, I have a great affection for Bach. I think he's the most, maybe the most ingenious composer, of that time. And he really was a very forward-looking, even I can't even describe just how smart his music is. It's just really brilliant.
Way to put it.
It's really brilliant stuff, and the more you dig into it, the more he comes out as the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You think of the D minor toccata and fugue, for organ, that's so famous, which everybody knows, and it's good, but there's so much other stuff out there that's wonderful. And when you start delving into his works and playing them, it just feels also very wonderful. And like, wow, so many things are coming to the fore. And when you play his music again, it's one of those composers that you can revisit many times for a certain piece and play it again and discover something new that you never heard before. So,
yeah. And he really does, and this is again, we a lot of people have talked about the Well-Tempered Clavier and why that was an important work. Both of those works, why they were so important, and they were. But you can see when I say he's forward thinking, I'm talking about like the way his chordal structures work, the way he moves in and out of keys so easily and so like deftly. It's amazing to see him work that way, and to take simple melodies and turn them into really grand. I love my Bach.
Yeah, it's interesting. You brought up the whole harmonic thing, and I think it's a really big discussion because, like we were mentioning before with Beethoven pushing the piano boundaries or the makers and vice versa, with Bach, I almost think he was pushing music as a whole because there wasn't a tuning system that was consistent, really. Right. And the A, we talk about the A being a different pitch than it is now. Back then, the typical A would have been, around 714, 720, something around there, hertz. And now standard, 414. Yeah. 420. And now it's 440. And even some places in Europe, it's maybe a little higher, 442. But that wasn't really standard. And also the type of tuning that was used, which is now kind of even tempered, or he has the well-tempered clavier, but there are different tuning systems, Pythagorean tuning, and tunings that would make the fifths more pure. But then as a result, you get thirds that are a little bit out. And because of how the physics works, it's pretty cool. if you do a perfect fifth, if you start at a low C, very low C, and you do a perfect fifth in nature, which would be a certain, I think it's a 3-to-2 ratio. Again, I didn't really do my research.
Yeah, that's right. It's
for
a
this
3-to-2
on
ratio.
the tuning,
Yeah.
but we've talked about it before. So if you do that, and then you go to the D, 3-to-2, and then you go to the A, and you go around the circle of fifths, by the time you get back to the C, it's not the same C as if you had done octave equivalency. So it's actually more like a D, C sharp or a D. It's quite high. And so on the modern instrument, actually everything's out of tune perfectly. So it's just slightly smaller. A perfect fifth on the piano, it's not the same as playing with a perfect fifth on a violin. And so therefore you can actually go in between different keys more seamlessly. When you hear early music of even into Haydn or some other Baroque composers, they wrote sonatas in predominantly some nice keys. You'd have like C major, G major, maybe F major. You didn't have a lot of pieces in C sharp major. It sounded bad. And it was meant to sound that way. And so when you have composers writing in a key that goes for a small bit into this other foreign key, which is far away, it actually doesn't sound good, and it's supposed to not sound good. But when Bach wrote his Well-Tempered Clavier, it's 2 books, and they're 24 preludes and fugues each in all the keys. And he starts from C, then C sharp, D, E flat, etc., moves up the chromatic scale, and they all sound good. And you could move those to any other key, and they would sound good. I think that was pretty revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, it really was. And let's also talk a little bit about the fugue as a form.
Sure. Yeah.
And what that is, and what a prelude and fugue is.
Mm-hmm. Well, a prelude is just an introductory piece. That's the term. And a fugue is, if you think of a canon, like everybody knows "Row, row, row your boat." So you start singing "Row, row, row your boat," then somebody else "Row, row, row your boat" right after, and you're kind of in sync with each other, but you're
like what
we would call a round, one measure off. So a fugue is similar to that, but on another level. So you take a theme, which might be a little more complex than "Row, row, row your boat," but not necessarily. And you play that theme, and then another voice would come in with the same theme, but in a different key, usually in the dominant, so in the 5th note of the scale. And then while you're playing that new one, the original voice, let's say voice 1, doesn't just repeat it like you do in "Row, row, row your boat." It goes into some material that would be accompanying the new theme, which we would call the subject. And so then voice 3 might enter, if you have a 3-voice fugue, and with the same theme, but back in the original key, typically. And then voice 1 and 2 are kind of accompanying that. And then it can get more complex from there. Most of the fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier are 3-voice. There are a couple 2-voice, couple 4-voice, quite a few 4-voice, and I think 2 5-voice fugues. And the way that they build on top of each other is pretty amazing. And not all 5 voices are necessarily playing at once, but the intricacy with which they're built is incredible. And actually there's a fugue, I should have again done my research for this. There's a fugue that Bach wrote that can be turned upside down and played with itself and works. And that's really cool.
Well, there's a famous story of him and a king. And I wish I could remember it, but where the king wants him to write a canon on a melody that he wrote that it was specifically written to not be canonized.
Oh, okay.
And so he does it, and he not only does it do it, but he does 4 versions of it, and it just blows everybody away. Kind of embarrasses the king, because the king was trying to up Bach,
of him,
and then the king, gives him some other, task based on that, and Bach turns him down, but he goes home and he writes an offering, which is
a musical offering,
a musical offering, which he wrote, which is, I don't know, 24 fugues, all based on that same theme. And
you don't mess with Bach.
No, you don't mess with. Like I said, he'll always end up the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, you can try, but in the end, he'll win. Yeah,
but
that's pretty amazing.
it's really amazing. And then and also the great thing about Bach is he's relatively, I mean, I kind of, he's timeless. Let me put it that way. I see him as a timeless composer.
Yeah.
He's relevant. His music works. I think it was a story of, what is his name in the 19th century? Who found Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring?
You mean like Mendelssohn?
Mendelssohn.
Yeah, they helped bring him revive.
Yeah, well, and this could totally be not a true story, but I'm going to tell it anyway because it's beautiful and romantic. But there's a story of Mendelssohn in an old library that first sees Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, never heard the piece, but looks at the music and just starts bawling in tears because it's so glorious and beautiful, and that is kind of what helps him on the journey of bringing Bach back to light, in people's eyes. And I
like
think it's like I said, it's romantic, it's beautiful. I hope it's true. But in other words, he was a guy that was kind of under the scenes, and then kind of in fact, I think I was listening to a discussion talking about Mozart and Beethoven, and how they would talk about Bach. And in those days, if you mentioned Bach, you're really talking about CPE Bach. You're talking about his son. Right. And so they would use terms like old man Bach and stuff like that when they were talking about J.S. Bach.
Yeah.
And how he was, and if you had to understand Bach, before you could become a great composer, you had to understand Bach, basically.
Oh, and they both did,
and they both did, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're great. I mean, we haven't even gotten into proponents and interpreters so much of Bach. But
in fact,
it's amazing.
It really is amazing. And because that goes, in fact, wow. Well, we need to continue this discussion because we need to talk about Glenn Gould. We have to talk.
Yep. That's a big discussion right there.
It is a big discussion, but you know what? In fact, let's for a second. Sure. Let's tell the one story, his Russia concert in 1957. Can you tell that story? And
so here's how I know. But first, for those of you who don't know who Glenn Gould is, he was a Canadian pianist, 1932 to 82. Quite an eccentric pianist, and wore for his entire life, indoors and outdoors, wherever he went, he wore a coat and gloves and a hat, and just very, very interesting man. And he became sort of this avatar of music by Bach, and has become sort of the reference point for a lot of Bach's music. Now, if you listen to his recordings of the entire Well-Tempered Clavier, which he's done both books, you might have recorded it even a couple times. Some of the preludes and fugues are a little bit, might say odd or just out of what we would expect. But it's still amazing. He just chose to do things. And he also became quite a performer and a recording engineer. So not just public performances. Actually, he withdrew from public performances in the middle of his huge career, booming career. He said, no, I'm just going to make recordings because of his ideas of perfection and whatnot. So some of his pieces, especially with the Goldberg variations, the second time you recorded, you see more of the artist as a recording engineer, not just as a pianist, because there are certain ways that he juxtaposed different tracks that you might not be able to do actually playing them live or together. It's pretty amazing. But
that's great.
Wonderful pianist, and the detail, if you watch him on YouTube, now you can see so much of this on YouTube. He gets into so much detail and the depth of the music and the sound and the ornaments. And hang on one second. And he also sings a lot with his playing. He's known for that, humming along and singing along.
That's right, yeah.
But back in the Cold War days, or no, even before that, really. But yeah, Soviet Union, right after World War II, there were no pianists from North America that went to Russia. There were a couple Russian pianists that had come to the U.S., and in the order, I'm thinking, let's see, Horowitz came first, and then I think Richter came, and then, Gilels first. I can't remember. And then actually this third or fourth or fifth was this woman who now teaches at McGill, Marina. I forgot her name. I'll think of it in a second.
Okay.
Marina Midavani. And then Ashkenazi came after that, and Berman and some others. But there weren't a lot of Western pianists going to Russia to perform. Well, Glenn Gould did in 1957. And from those who I've spoken to, one or two pianists who were actually there or around that time, they said that at the beginning, he went, either it was St. Petersburg or Moscow, and there weren't a lot of people in the hall. Maybe it was half full. And here's this pianist coming from the West playing Bach. And of course, in Russia, every student studied Bach. You were drilled with that from the time you were a young boy or girl in the conservatory. And who is this Canadian pianist coming to play? Who's ever heard of Gould? So he comes to play. And it was so phenomenal what he played that during the intermission, people went out to call, this is before cell phones, but they tried to reach other friends or family somehow, like, you've got to come and hear this. This is an incredible piano playing. You've never heard anybody like this before. And then for the second half, the hall was completely full. And just listening to all the nuances and beautiful things and he was in his early to mid 20s when he went over and did that concert. And it must have been mind-blowing for them to hear that, wow, this is a totally new way of thinking about this composer, which we thought we'd figured out and we knew everything about. And it was just a breath of fresh air. And when you listen to his recordings, you really do get that sense. It's just so interesting and so delicate and robust at the same time, and beautiful, always beautiful.
I remember hearing an interview with him where he even considered himself kind of a co-composer with Bach or with the works that he played. That he felt he was not just trying to be an avatar of the composer, but trying to co-create with him, and maybe that might mean playing something different than what was on the page, but that he was quite an eccentric and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he had a big ego too. That
for sure
certainly helped.
I want to say that you're co-creator with Bach. Yeah.
And I guess in a way, like all of us, we talk about performing and putting the composer first, and we just play what the composer tells us, and to an extent that's true. But it's like, what do you mean? What he tells he or she, in many cases, what they tell us as composers, because the way we hear it or feel it or think about it might be different from another performer, interpreter, and so. If we have a valid reason for interpreting something one way, that could be okay. And then we are kind of co-creating on the moment, on the spot. So maybe that's what he was going for. And also, like I said, he was a recording engineer and putting a lot of these things together that just would not have been really possible as in one performance. So he was creating things that weren't quite there. But his seminal recordings are amazing. He did the Goldberg variations twice, once early in his career, once late. They're both amazing. And I would highly recommend listening to those and the Well-Tempered Clavier.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're gonna leave it there for now. Again, we'll have to come back to this and maybe some more historical stuff and talk some more music history. But this has been a lot of fun. Elias, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has been. So, again, you check out, you can find Elias at his website, elias@axelpedersen.com. I'll put a link there, but I'll also put some show notes for some of the things that we've talked about here with these composers, some links you can listen to. I may try to find that, some of that Glenn Gould stuff as well. But again, really fascinating stuff. Thanks again. And everyone, you know the drill. You've been listening to And If Love Remains.
You are listening to And If Love Remains, a unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Lovett.